Hello, my name is Michaela, and I'm here today to discuss with you an article written by Linda Graham called Reconceptualising Inclusion as Participation, Neoliberal Buck Passing or Strategic Bypassing. This paper discusses the New South Wales government school system's increased identification of special educational needs. It talks about the historical progression of special education and conceptualisation of inclusion, as well as discusses the current barriers to inclusion. The information is supported by senior public servants who currently work in the Department of Education and Communities in New South Wales.
While this paper is based on the New South Wales education system, and we are currently based here in South Australia, it's important to note that New South Wales schools enrol 1 in 5 Australian school students and are the largest educational system in the Southern Hemisphere. Furthermore, Graham states that 750,000 students are enrolled in New South Wales government educational systems from preschool through to Year 12. Therefore, any data of New South Wales educational practices will contribute largely to Australia's statistics as a whole. As the name of this article suggests, Graham questions if governments and systems are redefining the term inclusion to mean participation and passing the buck, or in other words, ignoring what inclusion in education really looks like. While definitions of inclusion refer to equal participation in mainstream classrooms and the ability to learn along typically developing peers, McCauley and colleagues also define inclusive education as establishing and augmenting opportunities for students with disability, enabling them to be valued members of a school community. This might be in the form of social, psychological and developmental support for students with disability, enabling equal participation where possible. While this paper suggests that Australia is resistant to aspects of inclusive education, it is not to be mistaken that there has been no progress over the decades. It is, however, clear that there is no real impact on practice from these changes yet. Graham begins with a historical recount of inclusive education dating back to the 1800s, during which time children with disabilities were either kept at home or institutionalised. Deinstitutionalisation was only embraced in the 1960s. While this was seen as a step in the right direction at the time, it has since been re-evaluated as exclusive in the sense that it was still segregating students from the rest of the educational system by placing these students in special schools. I was surprised to read that it was only in the 1970s that teachers were urged to take more caution with the language they use to avoid inadvertent appellation. During this time, the Commonwealth Schools Commission stated that they supported the recommendation that students should not be segregated from their peers, regardless of if they have a disability. During this time, the Australian federal government encouraged what was defined at the time as integration. This referred to the movement of as many children as possible from special classrooms to mainstream classrooms. However, this caused a negative effect in some cases where schools formed support classes which were seen to act as surrogate special classrooms within mainstream schools. While the government began supporting the idea of inclusive practice by allowing equal rights to attend mainstream schools, the government ignored the need for teachers, practitioners and society to become more educated about disabilities and inclusive practices. This paper goes on to question the effectiveness of assessment for all in schools. The data collected by public servant policymakers uncovered that their intention of the NAP plan is to make these students visible and ensure that schools are held accountable for everyone's learning. However, I can't help but think that they are passing the buck to school teachers who may not be given adequate support to assist children with disabilities successfully or within such a structured test environment. And as we already know, children with disabilities and those such as ASD may simply learn in different ways. Currently, the department are strongly supporting a broader form of inclusion, which is that of student participation. It is suggested that the term participation includes students with disability as well as a larger community of learners. It is hopeful that in adopting a new discourse of participation and gaining outcomes that are of benefit to students who are often victims of standardised testing and accountability frameworks, that this may force silos to cooperate to achieve best outcomes for all. I currently work in the inclusive preschool program, and I'm very thankful that the Australian educational system has evolved in time in terms of its sense of inclusion, allowing students who require additional support to access it. I do, however, find it difficult to wrap my head around the idea of strategic bypassing, as to me this suggests that we're only looking at future children and not accommodating for our current ones. While standardised test results may uncover gaps within educational practices and force positive inclusive practice and support, I fail to see how this benefits students in the now. I feel very strongly about the need for the educational system to value inclusive practice more and steer away from the simple term participation, especially given that the site I'm currently placed at requires yearly funding by universal access to operate and in turn accommodate for children with disabilities. Sites that offer the inclusive preschool program certainly advocate for participation in mainstream wherever possible, however also allow children to have more one-on-one support from trained educators in an environment suitable to their needs.
To summarise, I can see how senior public servants might be strategically bypassing with intent to make positive changes, and I do not believe that they're intentionally passing the buck. However, I do fail to see how reconceptualising inclusive education as participation is going to have a positive impact for the future. Instead, I can see schools and educators receiving the backlash for low achievement and unfavourable standardised test results rather than the policymakers themselves. Thank you for listening.